all the parts of my body together form an object, my body, and all the parts of your computer together form an object, your computer. That also means there are weirder objects too, like the object composed of my right arm and Olivia Wilde, and the object composed of my big toe and the planet Jupiter, and the object composed of a trout and a turkey. A trout turkey. Objects don't have to have their parts touching each other. That sounds pretty strange. What the heck is a trout turkey? I've never seen one. And wouldn't universalism mean that if you bought 3 bottles of beer, you've actually bought 6 objects, because you've bought the 3 bottles and all the objects that are composed of all the combinations of them. But David Lewis says that an object just is its parts. If we have some object, all that means is that we have a collection of parts. If trout turkeys sound weird, that's because we're imagining that there's this extra thing, the trout turkey, in addition to just the trout and the turkey. But there isn't. The trout turkey is just the trout and the turkey, and the object that is the bottles of beer is just the bottles of beer. Lewis calls this Mariological innocence. Normally we don't talk about trout turkeys, we talk about what we think of as ordinary objects. And the Universalist said, whilst it's fine to talk about whatever objects we want most of the time, trout turkeys actually have just as much right to be called objects as anything else. In answer to the ship of Theseus, the Universalist says that there never was just one ship of Theseus, which seems to have gone missing. There were actually lots of objects there. The bow and the oars are an object, the mast and the deck are an object, Theseus, the men, the ocean and the ship are all an object. If we take one piece away and put it in the harbour, there is still an object made up of that and the rest of the ship, because it doesn't need to have the pieces touching in order to count as an object. Some thinkers have suggested that an object is formed only when certain conditions are met, like when 2 things are close to each other, or when they're causally linked, or in other words, that things sometimes form objects and sometimes don't. It depends on the circumstances. Crucially, that also means there will be borderline cases when it isn't clear whether something is an object or not. We can't get around borderline cases without being arbitrary, and that is bad. We don't want to do that. So, suppose your criterion for whether 2 parts form an object is how close together they are. Do they have to be a Planck length apart, 1 millimeter apart, 2 millimeters apart? And if it's 2 millimeters, then why not 2.1 or 2.5 or 3? In order to avoid being arbitrary about it and just saying that's what it is and having no reason for saying that, we're going to have to say that sometimes it's indeterminate. Sometimes something neither is nor isn't an object. And that's fine, right? I mean, it seems like my camera is one object, but if you were to take it apart and mail all those parts to different parts of the world, then it wouldn't really be one thing anymore. But if you were to smash it into 2 pieces, then it would still kind of be one thing, but it's broken, so maybe it's neither 1 nor 2? But unfortunately, that answer won't work. You see, whatever the number of things that exists is, it must be a number. Call it n. And imagine that we wrote a list of everything in the universe that exists. So there exists some x, and there exists some y, and there exists some z, and that list will be n things long. If it's sometimes indeterminate when things form objects, then our list must be indeterminate too. When we say that n number of things exist, that must be neither true nor false, which means that our sentence must contain some vague terms. But it doesn't. There's nothing in that sentence that's vague. Numerical expressions about how many things exist can't be vague, which means that our answer to the special composition question cannot involve vagueness, which would seem to suggest that either nihilism or universalism is correct. The answer to when do parts form objects must be either always or never. So, how many objects are there in the universe? In their video, How Many Things Are There?, Vsauce said that the number of fundamental particles in the observable universe is 10 to the 80, or 100 quinquavigintillion. If nihilism is true, then that is the number of objects, just all the fundamental particles. But if universalism is true, then we need all the possible combinations of those particles, which is 10 to the 3,240th power. That's 1 followed by 3,240 zeros. Now, I had some help with the maths for this episode, and as far as I'm aware, there isn't a name for that number. So as a thank you, I propose that we name it after the person who helped me with the maths and call it Marissa's number. If universalism is true, there are Marissa's number of objects in the universe. But what do you guys think? How many objects are there in the universe? And how do we count what counts as an object? Do you favour nihilism or universalism? Next time we could either do what is imagination or we could do what is fate. I'll put that one up for the vote again because so many people voted for it last time. Okay, last time we were talking about hedonism and pleasure, so let's see what you guys had to say. My favourite comment of the week came from Jose Hernandez, who brought up addiction, and said that if preference hedonism is true, if pleasure is any mental state that is desired, then having an addiction, desiring to be in a certain mental state, will bring you lots of pleasure. In other words, being an addict would be having a good life. This is a brilliant point, and Derek Parfit, one of the philosophers we were discussing last time, actually brings it up in a very famous attack on preference hedonism. Now, I think you can actually reply to Parfit, and I have actually made replies to him before in papers I've written here, and they get a little bit technical. So what I might do is I might make a whole nother video on hedonism and addiction just off the back of that comment, so well done to you. Congrats also to Matti Lehona and to myself, who are having a similar discussion along the same sort of lines. Max Hock asked, what did Robert Nozick, one of the philosophers we were discussing, say about the experience machine, this virtual reality machine that you can plug into and it can simulate any experience? Well, Nozick said that he thought most people wouldn't plug into the experience machine because we desire not just to experience certain things, but to be certain things. People want to really be loved or witty or funny or intelligent, not just to experience being those things. And we can have a discussion about whether we think that's correct and whether we think that's an important distinction to make. Sam Burns asked, if you went into the experience machine and it simulated a pleasurable life, then wouldn't you eventually just get bored of all of that pleasure? Well, remember that the experience machine can simulate anything you want completely realistically. So you can have it simulate your life as it is now, but just slightly better, or you could simulate a life which had challenge and suffering if you thought those were there to make you earn your pleasure, or those made pleasure good in contrast if you thought that those were needed there. So you can program anything into the experience machine you want. This was something that a few people didn't quite pick up on. So if you're one of these people who thinks that suffering is necessary to have contrast to pleasure, you haven't quite got out of the experience machine thing though, because the experience machine can simulate those things. Mads Jacobsen said that you'd have to leave behind all your friends and family in order to plug into the experience machine, so that wouldn't be a good life if you had to leave them behind. Well, yes, but remember that when you're in the experience machine, it erases your memories of the decision, so you think that it's real life, and you forget that that's the decision you made. And you could program simulated versions of your families and friends into the experience machine, so that when you interacted with them, you'd get those pleasurable experiences. But what you do touch on is a very important point, which is that Nozick seems to slightly load the dice when he asks, would you plug into the experience machine? And what a few philosophers and I have said in the past is that you should really be asking, would a life inside the experience machine be good? John Fielder said that pleasure can't be the only intrinsic good, because no matter how much pleasure people get, they always desire more. Well, that is actually still consistent with hedonism. It's consistent to say both that pleasure is the only intrinsic good and that people always want more pleasure. You say that people can only get true satisfaction from God. That's obviously a very big discussion that we could have for a long, long time. I could really talk your ear off about the philosophy of religion. It is very much my jam, even though I try and keep it off the channel. But I will say that if experiencing with God, or what people believe to be God, is an ingredient of a good life, then preference hedonism can actually incorporate that, because that is a mental state that people desire to be in, and therefore the preference hedonist would say that counts as a type of pleasure. That's all the time we've got this week. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode. Bye!